the delay, but those things happen as always. So today we have in our last seminar distinguished Professor David Harvey, and we are grateful for this. Thank you, David. He's joining us regularly to our seminars, and I think this is a very important issue for us. Professor Harvey is a prominent radical geography, one of the founders of radical geography worldwide. And he has been very helpful on many fronts with us here in Athens and in Greece in general. Today's speech has an interesting and very provocative title: What the abstraction of theory can tell us about the concreteness of practice. We thank you, David. So the floor is yours.
Well, sorry for the delay. My facility with electronic media is unfortunately extremely poor. At various times I want to be a Luddite and I want to throw it all in the ocean, and which is another way of saying I'm very, very sorry I can't be there in person. My visits to Greece were always a fantastic experience, and it has been a long-standing collaboration between you and me, and between many Greek scholars and myself. So I really missed that, and I would hope that we can make up for it a little bit in this Zoom manner. Now, the reason for the title, which I'd noticed suddenly came to me out of the blue, was that, of course, I had written this companion to the Grundrisse. And in writing the companion, both in Capital and the Grundrisse, I have been very concerned with trying to show what was relevant, what a kind of thinking coming out of those texts might be relevant for our understanding our contemporary situation. And the Grundrisse in particular, which had always been one of my favorite texts ever since it was published in English back in 1973. But when I was doing the companion, I think I started to see all kinds of other things going on in the Grundrisse, which were deeply relevant to interpreting the present situation. And in a double sense, that first in doing the companion, I was always looking for things which would help explain part of my tangible interest, which can broadly be put in the terms of urbanization and the dynamics of urbanization and the dynamics of uneven geographical development. My tendency was to sort of try and see what Marx was saying, figure out in what ways that might be useful to our interpreting urbanization and uneven geographical development and various other things going on around us. And then at the same time, presumably this would have an effect upon praxis, in the sense that, if we're going to overthrow something, we want to know what it is we're actually overthrowing. And so the idea was, and Marx is very explicit in Grundrisse halfway through it, he kind of says, we have to understand the concept of capital, because the concept of capital is foundational for understanding economics and also understanding the character of a bourgeois society. And therefore, one of the things I was trying to get out of the Grundrisse was a better understanding of what capital is all about. Now, in doing this, there are two preparatory things that I would want to point out. The first has to do with Marx's peculiarity of method of presentation. And this had first come to me when I was dealing with the context of capital, in which what I noticed was that the conceptual argument proceeds in what I would say is a very dialectical relational mode. You start with the notion of a commodity, which is a solid kind of thing, if you want to call it that. And you then say, well, actually, there are two sides to the commodity. So there's you go from this singular thing, the commodity, to two sides of it, and the two sides are use value and exchange value. And then you look at it and you kind of say, well, actually, behind this relationship between use value and exchange value, there exists something else, which is the commensurability of commodities and the fact that they're all products of human labor. So we have a third notion, which is value. So you go from commodity via the bifurcation into use and exchange value to the notion of value. And you then say, well, what is value about? Well, it has something to do with human labor. What kind of human labor? And we take something like value and we see that, say, there are two sides to value. There is the number of concrete hours, and there's abstract value, which is the abstraction of the value of all commodities, versus the concreteness of the actual number of hours which I work, and that Marx is going to work with abstract. So he goes on in this fashion between relative and equivalent forms of value, and he goes through these things until you get to the point where he kind of says, well, we finally find ourselves discussing a labor process. And in the labor process, there are two sides to it. There is the side of capital and the side of labor. And so we start to, so what you're doing is you're finding a unity, and then you're splitting it into two, and then you're finding another unity and splitting it into two, and you go on like this throughout capital. And by the time you get halfway through volume one, you finally get to the relationship between capital and labor. As the duality. But it's at that point that I then looked at the structure of the Grundrisse and said, well, the same thing is going on, but the starting point of the Grundrisse is not the commodity, it's the relationship between capital and labor. In other words, the starting point of the Grundrisse is the end point of what's going on in capital. So what we see in the Grundrisse then is a sort of unfolding. We have this relationship between capital and labor and a labor process. And we then divide that labor process in two dimensions. One is absolute surplus value, and the other is relative surplus value. Absolute surplus value is given by the number of hours that a worker works and so on. Relative surplus value has everything to do with productivity. And capitalists are fighting with each other and competing with each other in terms of the technology, and the technology becomes part of the thing, and we get all of the things going on in capital and also in the Grundrisse as you start to do these bifurcations. And the big bifurcations which starts to go on in the Grundrisse is between circulating and fixed capital. So you start, as it were, with alienated labor and alienated capital, which come together in the labor process. And then that labor process is producing the surplus value. And there are two kinds of surplus value, absolute, relative. And that absolute and relative then goes on into saying, well, okay, there's a dynamism here. And we start to get all of the arguments that go into things like what are the contradictions which exist in these bifurcations. And every time you have the bifurcation, what you're doing is you're talking about a contradiction. and an antinomy, as he calls it. So even if right back at the beginning, you have this tension between exchange value and use value. And if you're making use of it, you can't sell it, so you can't get the exchange value if you're using the use value. Similarly, you can't get the exchange value. So you see that there's an antinomy. They contradict each other. So we have a whole set of rolling contradictions which come together. And so part of what I was trying to do in the Grundrisse is to talk about how these contradictions work. And those contradictions are built around the idea of a totality, that at the end of the day, we want to understand the totality of what the concept of capital is about. And Marx is very explicit about, well, this is a limited investigation, but it's a crucial investigation because we live in a capitalist society. We want to know how capital works. In order to work how capital works, we've got to go through all of this analysis of use value, exchange value, and all the other things. So there is a kind of a flow. And at this point, Marx has to say that we have to, in talking about this flow, we have to start to talk about the different circulatory processes which are constituting capital. And this was one of the big points in the Grundrisse, which was to talk about these circulatory processes and the different circulatory processes. And people sometimes find this a bit complicated, but I tried to simplify it by saying, well, here is an analogy. Suppose we look upon the human body, and we look at the human body and we say, it is a totality. How does that totality work? And we would say, well, okay, we can start to actually see there are all kinds of circulatory processes going on inside of the human body. And each circulatory process attaches to certain kind of aspects of what's going on in the body. So that, for example, the heart is pumping blood around. And so there's the circulatory system. The circulation of the blood is a very ancient kind of idea, and of course it's foundational for understanding how a human body works. The lungs are taking in oxygen, and as you have a whole oxygen system there. Food and digestion go through the digestive tract, so there's another circulatory process there. There's waste which is expelled, and so you've got stuff going on in the kidneys and the liver and all this sort of thing, and then there's all the stuff that goes on in terms of the mind and neurology. So the messages from this, through the neurological thing, and of course in medicine what we find is what we call a concrete abstraction. We recognize every human body is unique. Yet at the same time, we can say, but at the same time that every human body is unique, they have certain things in common. And so at a certain point, so you can get a diagram of the human body and you see all these different circulatory processes, and they're all working together and supporting each other. Exactly how they connect to each other is still a bit mysterious, and there's still a lot of work going on to explain exactly how it is that the heart actually integrates with the lungs, which integrate with the gastroenterologist. But of course, the other thing about medicine is you get human specialists, doctors who are specialists in each one of these circulatory processes. So you know, if you have a problem with the heart, then you go to your cardiologist. If you have a problem with your lung, you go to a pulmonary specialist. If you're having problems in digestion, you have gastroenterologists, you have urologists, you have neurologists. So in a sense, you have lots of specialties dealing with each one. But at the same time, there is a holistic notion of behind medicine, which says to understand the human body, we have to look at all those different circulatory processes as they're working. And so what I'm saying is that we have to look about what Marx does in the Grundrisse is to start to look at the different circulatory processes that exist inside of a capitalist mode of production. Now, for instance, one of the circulatory processes which he isolates in Grundrisse is what he calls labor capacity. And labor capacity, therefore, starts to become, you say, okay, I'm going to be a specialist in labor capacity. capacity right now to look at how the circulation of labor capacity works. And this generates some findings which are parallel with the general findings which come out of this mode of approach. And the general finding would be that the health of the human body depends upon all of those circulatory processes working together. And that therefore, however, a human body can cease to function and people die because one of the circulatory processes stops. So if you see, so this immediately says, if this parallel is going to work, we're going to have to think about different modes in which crises can come about. Which circulatory system is going on the blink, and which circulatory system do we have to capture? And one of the circulatory systems is going to be circulation of labor capacity. Obviously, if circulation of labor capacity crashes, if it goes out, if there's no capacity to do it, then the capitalist mode of production cannot function. So the capitalist mode of production depends, like the human body depends on the circulation of the blood. So the capitalist system depends upon the circulation of labor capacity. Now, what does that circulation look like? Well, once I reconstructed it, it is five different moments in this. And when talking about circulation, Marx always starts to use the word moments, because within that circulation processes, there are a number of different moments which are key. And the circulation of labor capacity, the first moment you look at is the household, the place of origin of the person who has labor capacity. And somebody's at home sleeping, and they wake up and they get up and they have breakfast, they deal with the kids or something like that, and then they go off to work. So that's the first moment, is what's going on in the household. But the next point in the thing is the labor market. Now, generally speaking, people have labor already, but take a person who has not actually got a job. They go out and they search, and they go into a labor market. So the second moment is the moment of the labor market. And we can dissect that and look at it and see all the different things which go on, all the rivalries that go on. We see, as in individuals, workers kind of struggling in competition with each other because they try to get the jobs that others. So there's a certain set of social relations that get set up in the labor market, and therefore we have a moment called the labor market, which can be analysed and understood and expanded in certain kind of way, and therefore the worker has the experience of being in the household, and then in the morning, in the labor market, in the next day. Then suppose that the person gets hired. They go on to the next moment, which is the moment of production. And the moment of production is that the capitalist hires the laborer's capacity for 10 hours or something like that in a day. So the third moment is what goes on in the labor process, and the relations which go on there, and the relations in the labor process are very different from the social relations in the labor market. Yet the same person is carrying those different experiences into their life in terms of their understanding of the labor, what laboring is about. So you go through from the household, you go to the labor market, you go to the labor process. Then at the end of the day, the laborer gets some money and is free from the constraints of capital, but they now go out into the world and they've got money in their pocket. They are money managers, and the question is, what do they do with their money? How do they work with it? And all kinds of things happen there, which in Marx's day were not very big. He did talk about penny savings banks and things like that, where workers could save. But of course, in our time, one of the things that's happening in the money market is the use of credit cards. And if people don't have enough money, and poor people depend very much on credit cards because they often don't have money on Thursday to feed the kids, because the money doesn't come in until Saturday. So credit card culture becomes there's another set of experiences, which is, what is the experience of the worker when they go into the world with money and they're looking to actually use that money and manage that money, and they find themselves confronted with all sorts of capitalist institutions which are trying to get the money back from them. I mentioned credit cards, a very good example of that. You pay people a lot of money, and then you kind of you get it all back on the credit card culture and so on. So that's the fourth moment it was. But then the worker goes with that money into the supermarket and buys all kinds of commodities which need to be bought, and then takes them home and back into place into the household. So you see, the circulation of labor capacity has these 5 experiences: the home experience, the market experience, the labor process experience, the money market experience, and the commodity market experience. And one of the things Marx does is to say the consciousness of the laborer depends very much upon which of these markets you're in, because you get very different experiences, and the different markets actually integrate with each other, much as everything integrates in a human body, integrates in such a way that when you take a holistic view of it, you find that maybe capitalists are very generous and they give workers a higher salary, and so they have much more money. But then they actually get it back by credit card culture, or they inflate the prices of commodities. And so what Marx kind of says is that when the worker moves from being in the labor process to being a money manager to being a commodity buyer, they actually have a completely different perspective on the nature of the system they are in. And what this does is to suggest that the consciousness of the worker, which Marx always argues originates with tangible experiences, has to deal with the fact that people have very radically different experiences depending upon which moment they are in within the circulatory process. And one of the things that happens is that trade-offs occur between the different moments. In many ways, I think the whole history of capitalism has been about a Faustian bargain in which capital sort of says to labor, okay, we'll give you more money and we'll raise your wages, this kind of thing. But at the same time, as they actually raise the prices of all the commodities or create a commodity culture and a living culture in the living place, and everyday life and all the rest of it is structured in such a way that you have to have certain things and commodities and so on. So that actually capitalists can give at a certain point, say in the labor market, can concede because they can take it all back when it comes to the point of consumption, or where it comes to the point of utilizing money. And Marx actually makes a comment that when the laborer goes from the labor process into the supermarket via the money market, their consciousness is exhausted as a class person. The class relation is no longer central when they're in the supermarket. What's central there is the relationship between buyers and sellers. And so Marx kind of says there's different kinds of social relations which are crucial. So by looking at this kind of circulatory process and to look at it in this way, you would immediately say, well, actually, class struggle looks very, very different when you start to take a holistic view of it. We tend to think of class struggle as being about, and for a long time, people can have a concept of the proletariat, which is all about the experience of the labor process. But what Marx does in Grundrisse is to say, no, you've got these 5 points where there's a different kind of set of experiences. But the capitalist can actually offer these trade-offs and say, okay, yes, we'll give you more money, and at the same time, we'll get it back by raising land rents and all the rest of it, which is why I'm very nervous about, this chatter about universal basic income. You can, if you don't control what's going on at these other moments within the circulatory process, then you operate with only one of them, which happens and has been happening, by the way, when you start to say, people saying, well, we should raise the minimum wage. Well, yes, it's a very good idea. I like the idea of raising minimum wage, but if all land rents and housing costs and everything else, it all disappears in inflation, you're no better off. So you have to have an understanding of the dialectics involved in the unfolding and the contradictory nature of the consciousness that arises out of this. And I would kind of argue that if you look at it from the perspective of the worker, the worker may actually accept certain trade-offs and say, okay, I'll take this awful, terrible job, horrible, 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 provided I get enough money that I can take it back to the neighborhood and I can have a good time in my everyday life or something of that kind. So this is politically important, because if you concentrate all of your politics on the moment of production, and you don't actually take the holistic view, this is a bit like saying, well, the only thing that matters in the human body is the human heart. Well, it's true. You know, everybody who dies at a certain point, the heart stops beating. So in which case you say, okay, well, everybody dies of heart failure. Well, but the theory of crisis in Marx is going to be about not that sort of thing at all. It's not just simply the failing of what's going on at the point of production. It can be in any one of the others. If there's a sort of mess up in some to the circulatory process, we're in deep trouble. So now what this says is that we should actually start to think about a holistic approach to class consciousness and class formation, which is about the circulatory process of this kind, and to then start to think about the ways in which we can incorporate struggle, social struggle at say the point of consumerism, social struggle there, and say, look, this is part of the holistic vision of class struggle, and then say to ourselves, well, in a particular social order, what's the problem here? So if you go back and look at, say, 2007, 2008, and look at the crisis around that time, you kind of say, is it a crisis of the falling rate of profit, as a lot of people kind of in Marx circles would say? And I would say, no, that's missing the point. What you have to do is to look at that crisis and look at the circulatory processes, look at which one of them is being held up and why, and where the blockages are. Marx frequently talks about barriers and blockages which get overcome. And I think that what he's doing here is to insist that us thinking about the circulatory processes as an abstraction. But then when you start to think of it as an abstraction, you then kind of say, but this has very concrete consequences for how we understand what class struggle is about, and the role of, say, housing struggles in relationship to labor struggle in the point of production, to everyday life struggles in and around the household. So you can start to think of the thing that way. In the same way, holistic medicine becomes very important to maintain, and we don't want to get back into that kind of specialized medicine which only understands the very one particular circulatory process. So it seems to me that one of the consequences of this form of argument I'm making is to say that we've got to be very broad in terms of looking at the circulatory processes, look at where things can go wrong in that circulatory process, and then look at how that circulatory process is working, and start to think politically around the holistic notion of class, in which radically different experiences sort of are incorporated within the circulatory process, and those different experiences give rise to different levels of consciousness. And whether you think of yourself as a worker, as a consumer, or as an everyday life person, or a person in the labor market, as a commodity in the labor market, how you think of yourself depends upon which one of these circulatory moments you are in, and what kinds of experiences you have there. So you have this sort of kind of thing going on, which is, if you like, the first major argument I would want to make. The second major argument is extending a little bit this idea of circulatory processes, because there is a big conflict at a certain point in terms of raising a big conflict at a certain point over the dynamics of technological change. And what Marx does is talk about relative surplus value, talk about the way in which technological change is pushed through what he calls the coercive laws of competition. In other words, I'm competing with you, and if I have a superior technology, I can sell my product cheaper than you do, and I can force you out of business. So the competition is over technology. technological innovation becomes a key means by which individual capitalists can try to game the system and make particular advantage. And so we get this contrast between absolute and relative surplus value. And one of the consequences, as Marx points out, is that actually the competition for technological advantage increases relative surplus value, but in increasing relative surplus value, it actually substitutes labor and creates technologically induced unemployment. So that this means that fewer laborers are employed, less value is produced, and we get the famous argument on the falling rate of profit. And the falling rate of profit is then sort of a significant aspect of the dynamics of the system. But one of the things that Marx does, both in the Grundrisse and Capital, is to point out that the capitalists are not necessarily interested in the rate of profit. They're only interested in the rate of profit, provided it gives them more mass, because they are interested in the accumulation of wealth. And the accumulation of wealth means that if you just take the money form of it, means that you've got more and more and more money. So that's what you're after. And, you can have a high rate, but you have a very little mass. And that doesn't make you very significant. So if you kind of say, what is it that makes a billionaire? It's not that they have high rates of profit. What it is that they have a huge mass of value that they control. And the US is the most powerful country in the world because it has the greatest mass. And when China starts to create enough mass, it becomes a second important. So we have capitalists are actually interested in the mass of the profit, because mass is where the economic and political and social power comes from, and that is the sign of their wealth. Then there are two ways you can augment the mass. One is absolute surplus value, which is increasing the length of the working day and all the rest of it. And the other is by employing more laborers. And when the falling rate of profit kicks in and you start to have actually less and less laborers there, then your mass is likely to diminish. So in order to do something, what you need to do is to actually, even though there's a falling rate, you're going to increase the number of laborers you employ. So there's a strong incentive to do that. And so you get what Marx calls in Capital Volume 3, the dual law of a falling rate and a rising mass. And the rising mass is absolutely critical. And one of the ways in which you create the rising mass is, of course, through technological change and through the deployment of machinery and things like that, which says that a certain part of capital goes into actually improving the productivity of labor. So we take machinery and all machines and things like that, and the machines are actually a fixed capital. They last a considerable amount of time. So what you have is a circulatory process, which is the circulation of fixed capital, which is the second category that Marx looks at specifically in the Grundrisse. He looks at the circulation of labor capacity, then he goes on to the circulation of fixed capital and says circulation of fixed capital is very different from the circulation of circulating capital. Circulating capital, things are just going on round and round and round. With fixed capital, what you're doing is you're taking part of capital and you're putting it into an arena which is going to increase the productivity of labor. Now, as you increase the productivity of labor and you increase the mass of product, so you get this transition from sort of individual production to mass consumption production, and that carries with it the necessity of the realization in terms of mass consumption. So this is another part of the story. And so Marx starts to talk about what's involved in fixed capital formation. And he also talks about something called the consumption fund, which is all of those items we use to assist us in consumption. Consumption fund would be, say, the car we use for pleasure, the house, the kitchen equipment that we have, the stoves and all these kinds of things. This is what's called the consumption fund. But let me leave that aside for a moment and just talk about fixed capital. So fixed capital comes along, and Marx points out that if you're going to have fixed capital and you're going to buy a machine and all that kind of thing, you need to actually put aside and take stuff away from current consumption and put it into something which lasts over 5, 10, 15 years. So this is quite a stress and a strain on an economy. But he says that one of the consequences of the investment in fixed capital is that productivity of labor rises. And as the productivity of labor rises, so you get and actually surpluses of capital and surpluses of labor being generated by capital. Now, this is a kind of interesting thing, because he starts off by saying, in order to have fixed capital, you need surpluses of capital and surpluses of labor, and you have to generate those by actually curbing consumption. But after a bit, when this gets going, the productivity increase leads to a situation in which actually capital is producing surpluses of capital and surpluses of labor side by side. So actually it's producing the conditions which are conducive to more fixed capital formation. So you can imagine actually kind of a productive circle, a spiral setting in motion, which is going to be very interesting to look at, because the dynamics are that you are producing the conditions which are ripe for fixed capital formation, and you're doing it in a way that produces, supports the further development of those conditions. So actually at this point, you start to kind of say, Marx points out that, well, this dynamic can be very strong. And it can become so strong that we end up, as it was also true of the falling rate and rising mass, of a huge mass of surplus value and labor, which needs to be employed, and you've got to find employment for it. And in Marx, by and large, there's a tremendous emphasis, because of volume 1, on production, but not so much emphasis on realization. But Marx, in Grundrisse, is kind of saying realization is a big problem. In fact, we need labor. In fact, we need consumption capacity, not simply labor capacity, but consumption capacity. And therefore, the whole kind of question is then what to do about fixed capital formation, which is going on in such a way that it's actually creating conditions of more fixed capital formation. And that dynamic is a very unhealthy dynamic at a certain point. So Marx kind of says, well, actually, one of the things you want to do is if you possibly can, you want to create forms of fixed capital formation that do not contribute to the productivity of labor. In other words, you produce useless things. And this is fascinating. He said, as capital goes on, it's likely to produce more and more useless things and stupid things, and because it needs to absorb the surpluses of capital and labor that are being produced, but do it in a way that doesn't produce more surpluses of capital and labor. And the only way you can do this is to find forms of investment. This is what I call the bridges to nowhere side of capital. Capital actually produces a great deal of incentive to build bridges to nowhere. And bridges to nowhere are extremely interesting, because you think to yourself, well, actually, all the money put into that bridge is lost. No, it's not. Because think of the construction companies that built the bridge. Think of all of the materials producers that produce the materials that produce the bridge. In other words, you build a bridge for $20 million or something like that, and $15 million of it is actually returned into the circulating capital. So the circulating capital booms, and more surplus value is produced by the construction people of the bridge, and raw material producers of the bridge and all the rest of it. So in the end, it doesn't matter that the bridge goes bankrupt. So that actually Marx kind of says a lot of the time, big initiatives of this kind go bankrupt. And then what happens is that they're sold for almost nothing. And there comes the role of bankruptcy in the perpetuation of capital. So this fixed capital thing becomes rather significant. And I kind of look at this and kind of say, actually, capital deliberately produces waste. And there are two areas where this happened. And I think after World War II, we see two areas of this. One area is, of course, military investment. This is a fantastic way and Marx kind of says, putting money into all of that stuff is like dumping a value in the ocean. so you think about actually the role of military expenditure since 1945 and role to this day. And I still get angry when people start saying, well, we've just given $40 billion to Ukraine. No, you've given $40 billion to the US defense industry to produce the goods to give to Ukraine. So actually, military Keynesianism, as we call it, that is actually terribly, terribly important. And if you kind of say, what has been the role of the military in the capitalist mode of production since 1945? It has been, the Cold War was a beautiful kind of example of sort of a whole mode of excrescence, which was really foundational for capital to absorb a large amount of goods, which quickly becomes obsolete because you've got to fight a jet of a certain kind. You need to replace it. So so that area is one area. The other area is what I would call useless urbanization. And it's amazing. Look, you look at what's going on in New York. There's a vast building spree going on in New York. Condominiums going up all over the place. Big talk about condominiums, conversion of office spaces into condominiums and so on. All for the affluent and the wealthy. And so you have a vast investment going on in housing at the same time as you have an affordable housing crisis. Well, that doesn't surprise me at all, because it's always been the case that if you can't, if housing is there for purposes of providing profit to developers, it's completely different from housing there, which is needed for people. So again, we have a sort of situation. So urbanization and these projects we have in New York, macro projects, mega projects, they're all over the place. And in fact, well, again, one of the things that's gone on since 1980 has been a great deal of surplus capital and surplus labor has been employed in mega projects which don't actually produce anything in the way of social productivity or social well-being. And in fact, in many ways, since they destroy urban neighborhoods by wiping out older housing, they often do go in exactly the opposite direction. But again, this has a lot to do with the logic, if you like, of fixed capital formation. And the logic of that is laid out in the Grundrisse. And so it starts to, for me, in practical terms, to kind of say, well, if you didn't have military expenditures, let's suppose we cut all that down. Let's suppose we cut down useless organization and developed actually a form of urbanization, which was good for the populace at large. Capital wouldn't know what to do. It would end up with surpluses of capital that wouldn't know what to do. And so one of the things we got to do is to start dealing with what might be called wasteful, stupid macro projects and so on, and recognize that actually the absorption of the mass is becoming a very critical problem. And I think you can see a little bit where I'm going with this, and I'm not going to have time to talk about it now, that it's hard to get from an argument about the falling rate of profit to something like the climate crisis. The rising mass is perfect for understanding the climate. And in other words, the rising mass is important. Fixed capital starts to, bridges to nowhere are being built all over the place. Look at that urbanization in the Gulf states. Can you say that is socially well contributing to the social welfare of the population? You look at that, and you kind of say, yeah, they're making a fantastic amount of money. Developers are doing that. Now, so there's something, but there is another link here, and it's a bit like the same way value theory came out of use and exchange value. So you start to kind of say, look, there's fixed capital and circulating capital, and it's a complicated relationship between them. And we don't know quite how to manage that, how to work it. And at this point, we find that actually, well, you can't have fixed capital formation, and you cannot have construction fund formation going on without actually using the credit system. Now, one of the things I find is that if you ask the questions how something happened, you can end up with all sorts of descriptions of financialization, for example. How did it happen? I've always argued that, yeah, it's good to have studies of how, but more important is why. In the 1960s, we used to ask why far more than how. And if we ask why did we get financialization, we then get a sort of major macro kind of thing, which is kind of really, I think, it's just really incredibly significant. One of them is this increasing reliance upon fixed capital formation and consumption fund formation and the circulation of capital in the future, and the building of things that last 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. This requires a credit system. In other words, the credit system is not parasitic, it's actually foundational for fixed capital circulation. But there's something else going on here, which is also significant. Rosa Luxemburg and the accumulation of capital takes on the following kind of question. Marx sets up reproduction schemas in volume 2 of Capital. And he does one which is kind of without any expansion, and it works very nicely. There's a real problem with the dynamic one. And the real problem is this. You're producing more surplus value, but where are you selling it to? In other words, there's a contradiction between production and realization. And the realization possibility is complicated. Now, Malthus understood this, and he said, the only reason you can actually make capital work is that you have a bunch of consumption classes over here. That is, people who consume but don't produce. But they have money to now, that meant, you know, historically, this may have been significant, it may have been important. And there are all sorts of other ways in which this could be finessed. But the foundational way is this fixed capital thing, which is actually going to work very well for absorbing the surplus. But then we've got this question of where's the effective demand going to come from? Now Keynes came along and said effective demand is terribly important, but Ricardo said effective demand is not important, and Ricardo mocked Malthus for saying effective demand is important. And by and large, people took the Ricardian view, and Ricardo dominated up until Keynes came along and said, you can't, you know, you've obviously got to go the Malthus way, which is understanding that consumerism has to happen. Now, the various ways in which consumerism can be bolstered and effective demand can be bolstered, and we know part of that is going to be through state interventions, and so this becomes absolutely significant. But what Rosa Luxemburg did was to say, well, where does the effective demand come from? You have to have some external source of effective demand. So she, in a brilliant kind of move, she kind of said, well, actually, the thing here is it came from China. It came from China in the following way. There was a lot of silver in China, and so the British were going to exchange their products with the silver, but they couldn't do it directly, so they persuaded the Indians to grow opium, and then the British sold opium to China, and then the Opium Wars in the 1840s forced the Chinese market open, so Chinese silver could go down to India to put opium, and then from India could go to London. So she kind of said it was neo-colonial practices that allowed this to happen, and it's actually rather wonderful. You know, because when Mao came to power, one of the things he said, 100 years of humiliation at the hands of the imperialist powers is over. We will never, never, ever be in that situation again. And interestingly, of course, the situation is now reversed. I'm amazed. I'm sitting there, I'm watching, and there's Biden going and begging the Chinese to stop sending fentanyl to the United States. And you kind of go, this is the kind of like, this is the reverse of what happened during the Opium Wars. But nobody seems to see it as an ironic joke, because it's not a joke, because many people are dying of fentanyl poisoning, and many people died of opium in China. So there is this side of things. But when the world is totally conquered, as it were, and is totally integrated, and China is now starting to produce its own stuff and so on, when it becomes totally, then where, in the last resort, do you go in order to get enough effective demand to actually deal with the expanding output that's going on? And the answer is very simple. You borrow, you create credit. In other words, you do things on credit. In other words, the credit system becomes the center of effective demand, which is something that Keynes recognized. But all the other ways of dealing with the effective demand problem were exhausting. And I've mentioned urbanization and I've mentioned militarization. But now we're talking about the huge growth in indebtedness. And indebtedness is not an excrescence on the system. It is something which is built into its nature. And this is the important thing about Marx's argument in Capital, that it's the nature of the capitalist mode of production is that it produces situations in which the only answer is to actually borrow. And therefore the credit system becomes absolutely crucial to the survival of capital. Now, a lot of people on the left kind of say, you know, so it's all parasitic. It's parasitic in excrescence and so on. No, it's not parasitic. It's foundational to how the system works. There were other means of dealing with the effective demand problem, and Keynes, of course, set up ideas about state-led credits and so on. So that whole argument is also very significant there. So what this says is that if we actually look at the macro thing and look at the totality, and that was what I was looking at in the Grundrisse, what I've been trying to look at since. When you look at all of this, you see waste, you see other things, and you see political logic of a certain kind. And there was a figure that came in the Grundrisse 3 or 4 times, and was a sort of shadow over it. And it's a sort of question that Marx sort of poses, well, what would an emancipated laborer think? And I find this figure of the emancipated laborer very, very important. I don't think we can sit with traditional news of the proletariat as being the vanguard and all the rest of it. I think the vanguard is likely to be emancipated laborers, autodidacts who understand the totality of the system within which is being worked. Because what's happening right now is we're working and we've got lots of partial pieces. We need to look at the totality, and we need to take even these macro things and understand their dynamics. I mean, just to give you one last thing to look at, which is, I think, very interesting, is that Marx kind of says, well, the turnover time is very important. Shorten the turnover time. You shorten it, shorten it, shorten it. If you're shortening turnover times in production, you've got to shorten turnover times in consumption. So you've got to find forms of consumerism that have a certain instantaneous turnover time. And guess what? Those forms of consumption are experiences because they're almost instantaneously over. And it's no surprise whatsoever when you understand that, and you understand the dynamics of turnover times and the consumerism times have to be shortened. I mean, if capital only made things that lasted 100 years, and I always mention the fact that I'm using my grandmother's knives and forks, which are about 140 years old. If it only made things like that, it would have lost its way long ago. It wouldn't be able to expand. Now it expands by actually producing things. So we have something like, my favorite example of this is a cruise liner. Yeah, okay, you go to cruise liner, you have a 10 days experience or 4 days experience or something like that. Vast amount of capital goes into the fixed capital of it. Vast amount of labor is employed and all the rest of it. But the foundation is the purchase of an experience, which is all over. We have a tremendous expansion, of course, of sports and things of this kind, and festivals and all the rest of it. In other words, you know, a Taylor Swift appearance is, you know, a huge event. So we actually specialize in events. And so if you actually kind of look at the qualities of life as they were in, say, 1950 and 1960, and you looked at something like the opening of the Olympic Games or something like that, you could kind of say, no, this is an event. But it wasn't capitalized in the same way that it now is, but it's hugely capitalized right now. We're going to see in Paris an event And of course, a lot of this is also about the Netflix economy and the rest of it. In other words, the production of experiences, ecotourism. Tourism, if you look at one of the answers to what was going on after 2007, 2008, the number of international air flight connections went from something like 400 million or something like that to 1.4 billion between 2008 and just before the pandemic. In other words, tourism becomes a huge area because this instantaneous consumerism. And you say, so instead of saying, well, let's look at the tourist industry and see how it managed to get into being so highly capitalized. Yeah, it's very important to understand how that happened. But why it happened is even more significant. Could capitalism have survived without actually capitalizing instantaneously? Instantaneous. And actually, it's how many countries, I mean, I don't know to say this to Greece, how many countries are foundationally relying upon tourism these days? I mean, it's astonishing. So these are the sorts of macro things that lead into micro understandings, which lead in, it seems to me, into a completely different sense of what kind of political practice is. An emancipated person might actually, or an emancipated worker might actually start to think about conjoining. So that's where I'm at. And sorry it goes so quickly, but there we are. Have I exhausted my immediacy? What do we do? Do we go for some questions? And